Thank you. Well, this working? 1, 2. Yep, 1, 2. So this has become a bit of a tradition to do an accessibility panel at FITC because we've been doing this for about 3 years, which is great. Jordy, so this is going to be interesting. You have George and Jordy, and it's not just Jordy, it's Jordy Gibbons, so we're going to do a little tongue thing. So this is interesting because when we started doing accessibility presentations, we're talking about accessibility at FITC. There were 20-odd people who couldn't fit in the other sessions, and this was about 5 years ago. And here you are today. So thank you for coming. I hope this is going to be informative. The way we're going to do this is I'm going to try to moderate, but I was asked if I can add in my perspective when I can. But I'll try to be more of a moderator than a presenter. But we're going to do a 1-minute introduction for each one of us, so really fast. And then Jordy's going to tell us a bit about the latest accessibility developments and stats in Ontario. And then we're going to dig into it, and we're going to tell you how different tech companies handle accessibility and how they're structured as an organization, and basically how we handle accessibility in a way that makes us successful, and we build products that are accessible, and so on. So I'm going to start with Jen. If you want to
Hello.
introduce. Hi.
So, hi everyone. Thank you for coming. I know it's probably been a while of a day. I'm a UX research lead here in Toronto, based out of Shopify. And I lead a team of researchers in Montreal, Waterloo, and Toronto. And in terms of accessibility, it's been kind of a grassroots effort at Shopify so far. And I've been playing a role of facilitating a lot of different efforts in the company so far. So I'm excited to share some of that with you.
Thank you. David?
Hi, I'm Dave. As a child, I grew up on a goat farm. I like to put that out there. And
That
so
was not in the script. This was not in the script.
I took a weird route to get where I am. I guess you guys might be interested that I used to hack on Dojo when that was a big thing. And basically engineer up through working in the web space and then working on the browser itself, because browsers are painful, right? So then let's see, the browser work basically led to the engineering management work. So any questions about Firefox, just come to me after.
Go ahead, Jordy.
All right, well, my name's Jordy. I'm one of the senior advisors at the Accessibility Directorate. So that's the department of the Ontario government that's responsible for implementing the AODA, the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. And so big thanks to all the people who agreed to speak on the panel again this year. Big thanks to George again for moderating. We started doing this panel because obviously, accessibility, the mission of the Accessibility Directorate, the goal of the AODA is to make Ontario an accessible province by 2025, which is a very broad goal. Obviously, accessibility touches on many different areas of life, including web development and the development of different digital products. So I did this last year. How many people here, put up your hand, are here because they're working for a client who said that the project that they're working on needs to be accessible, needs to meet accessibility requirements?
Put your hand like really high and pretend that you signed a waiver. I could take a picture of you.
Okay, now how many people then are here because they're just a little bit interested in what's developing in the world of accessibility? Okay, great. Now how many people here would say that 10 years ago they'd never heard of accessibility in the context of what they do? So you can see, just by that short show of hands, how quickly accessibility has become a current issue in the industry. And that can be said about a lot of different industries that are looking at this as a new way to generate access for people who haven't had access before. Can I skip to the next slide, George?
I'm the clicker.
He's the clicker. So basically, I'm going to run through this really quickly because these are Ontario's accessibility standards. There's 5 of them, and they're meant to set sort of like the baseline minimum of accessibility that's expected in the province for different organizations that have to comply. But you know, we talk about the minimum level of accessibility, but what we're here really to talk about today are best practices in accessibility, right? This sets the minimum standard, and we love to talk about going well beyond that, and that's why I'm really happy to have all our panelists here to talk about how they approach it. So we have requirements for customer service, we have requirements for employment, transportation, the design of public spaces, and the web accessibility requirements are underneath the information and communication standard, so the accessibility standard for information and communications. So there's about 2 requirements in there out of about 200 that impact web accessibility, but they're powerful requirements. So as you can see, the requirements basically impact organizations with 50 or more employees. So if you have a client that you're working with, if you're developing a public-facing website, it doesn't impact intranet, it only impacts internet. If they're developing a public-facing website and their organization has 50 or more employees, they do need to meet WCAG level 2.0. And that includes content on the website. So that's a really common question. Even if you do develop a website that meets WCAG requirements, the content on the website needs to continue meeting those requirements. So that's been a challenge for a lot of organizations. So in a lot of cases, it's not just a challenge for the people building the website and building the content, it's a culture change issue within the organization. The people generating that content need to pick up some skills on how to make that content accessible moving forward. By January 1st, so basically, this is not a retroactive requirement, right? So if you have an existing website that you haven't refreshed in a significant way, then the requirements don't kick in. It's when you're building a new website that you have to meet them. So you don't have to rebuild your old website, but if you're rebuilding a new one, that's when it kicks in. But that does change. So by January 1st, 2021, that retroactive clause is removed, and the website has to be accessible regardless. So, 2021 is not that far away, if you really think about it. So if you are designing a website now, you really do have to think about meeting WCAG 2.0, and then the requirement goes up to level AA. And again, that impacts web content. There are a couple of exemptions to the WCAG requirements that concern live captioning and audio description. Essentially our standard points to the global standard. So W3 created the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. They're fairly high level. There's about 60 success criteria in there. Yeah, something like that.
The answer is yes.
Yeah, at least. And I mean, depending on what success criteria you meet, you're going to meet level A, level AA, level AAA. And if you go to our website that I'll show you at the end, there's a full list of the success criteria that you need to meet in order to meet Ontario's standard. But again, that's like a baseline standard. And if you want to go beyond that, you're encouraged to do so. The W3C guidelines are fairly high level, so we try not to get too prescriptive because we do realize that this is impacting a lot of different organizations and a lot of different situations will come up. So it has sort of high-level guidelines around there has to be significant contrast between the text and the background so it can be seen. It needs to interface with screen readers and stuff like that. We do work with different organizations to provide resources that are up on our website. For example, the Global Alliance for Accessible Technologies Environments. We developed a couple of guides with them that you can access. You want to go to the next slide? These are a couple of resources for content creators within your organization. It shows you how to develop a document from the beginning as an accessible document. So from the point when that PDF starts as a web document or a Word document or a PowerPoint, that'll give you the instructions on how to make it accessible. So you're starting at the source with accessibility. Can you hit the next slide, George? This is a guide we developed with the Registered Graphic Designers Association. It's about accessible web design and about accessible graphic design. It gives you some rules of thumb for hex codes and font types and sizes, and that's a really useful guide. Registered Graphic Designers Association is a really fantastic organization it's got on board with accessibility. And if you go to their site, you'll find all kinds of different resources. And finally, the last slide I'll put up is just our contact information. There's our website, ontario.ca/accessibility. There's also a phone line you can call if you have questions about how the law applies to what you're doing. And you can reach us basically 8 to 5, Monday to Friday.
Thank you, Jordy. When we were talking earlier, you were telling me some interesting statistics or information about where accessibility is in terms of whether companies do it and how often do you do it and so on. Would you mind sharing that?
Yeah, that's a good point. So these are standards, right? They're not guidelines. The W3C created guidelines. We created standards, so they're mandatory. So we do have a compliance and enforcement unit. So the way we approach compliance is mostly we take a public education view, and it's a self-certified compliance process where an organization needs to file an accessibility report with us if they're of a certain size. It's 20 more employees. So the next time these organizations need to report to us is January 31st, 2017. So, a year and a couple months from now. And from that, we see, okay, this percentage of organizations have reported. Out of those organizations, this many people are, having trouble with these requirements, with employment, with web accessibility, whatever. And we model our outreach compliance enforcement model on those statistics. So say you are an organization and you do run afoul of Ontario's accessibility laws, because we do have compliance and enforcement officers. You might get a call, and they might ask you for some proof of compliance with one of the requirements. If you're found to not be in compliance, it's not the worst thing in the world. You do have to work pretty hard to get a fine under the AODA. It has happened, and companies have paid them, and that's just the way the law is enforced. But what immediately happens is if you're found to be in non-compliance with the AODA, you work with a compliance officer to come up with a plan. We say, you have 60 days to come into compliance with this requirement, that requirement. Can you meet this? Can you meet that? We're going to help you using our public education resources. We have an entire public education unit. And then, if the company ignores us or, misses deadlines repeatedly, you'll get a director's order that notifies you that you're going to have to pay a fine if you don't come up with this proof of compliance within 30 days. And then even after that, the company can appeal it in court. A couple of companies have tried to appeal it, but they've all lost because our compliance officers are very reasonable and do what they can to bring companies into compliance rather than penalizing immediately.
That's great. One of the key takeaways for me is because I used to work for a fairly large company, a Canadian bank, on accessibility. There was a lot of discussion on how often does this happen? When do we report? Are they actually going to check what we're doing? The key takeaway for me is that accessibility is happening. It's only a matter whether for us working accessibility at different companies, we want to be compliant, or we want to kind of start early and build our products and the stuff that we sell, whether it's a product or service, become accessible as a matter of a standard process. So that to me is kind of a warning, whether you're working in a large company or you're working for an agency who's doing work for large clients. And by the way, this is not unique to Canada. This is all over the world. In fact, in a lot of other places, it's arguably even more, what's the word? The legislation it's even stronger. This is very exciting if you welcome accessibility. If you're new to it, this may be scary, but you don't have to, because we have some models and examples and things that we can share about how different companies do it. So let's get into it. Does that make sense? We're going to start with a really small, light question, and that is, David, can you tell us about the biggest accessibility challenge you've had? How did you solve it, and what did you learn from it, and when? I was told to go easy, so.
I would say the biggest one is not solved yet. Can I do that?
Go wild.
I was talking to George a little about this before, and we were unsure whether this audience would be interested, so I'll make it quick. Browsers are multi-process now. It makes writing browser engines more and more complicated. Firefox was single process for a long time. We had some threads for doing networking, but we didn't really have, more than one process. So more than one process is important for security and user perception of performance. Accessibility in the browser is one of the more, it's complicated machinery. We are probably the heaviest user of internal browser API. And so making that multi-process has been a nightmare. But we're looking at Firefox 52 as our target.
So I'm nodding, but I have no idea what he's talking about. Because, and I don't know, does anybody, if you're fairly technical or very technical, have you ever had to work with multi-processes to make your product faster?
Yeah.
Better?
Faster.
Yeah. So that's way too technical.
You probably had to deal with asynchronous stuff, right? So that's probably sort of part of it. No.
Okay, so that was a big challenge. Jen, maybe you can tell us about a recent accessibility accomplishment at Shopify. And this can be anything that you would consider an accomplishment. It can be culture or technical or stuff that you feel proud of.
Cool. I think one of the big wins, like quick wins that we did was we started writing a series of blog posts. And you can find them on Medium if you're interested in accessibility or inclusive design. We wrote a series of very hopefully inclusive blog posts just to talk about some kind of building blocks to better UX through the lens of accessibility. So looking at alt text, color contrast, some really hopefully simple starter kind of steps that you can think about for improving accessibility online. And that was a really great way of getting people from different disciplines to write. So we had someone from our content strategy team write about alt text and what it is, how to approach it, how to break it down into manageable pieces and tackle it. We had a designer write about color contrast, front-end development, talking about, I think, performance. So I think that was a really great win for us because it was a great way for people to express their interest in the topic and also share with others within Shopify who maybe don't have the same awareness, and also the broader community.
Mm-hmm. So would you say that it was a kind of a multidisciplinary initiative, accessibility initiative?
Yeah, for sure. And kind of where it came from was that we got a group of different disciplines together from our UX team. So our UX team at Shopify consists of front-end development, design, research, and content strategy. And so we had all of the leads or someone from each discipline come out to an initial meeting just to learn about who was interested in contributing to accessibility. And that group formed, and then this was one of several initiatives that came out of that group coming together to brainstorm stuff. So,
that's awesome. One of the things that used to happen, at least in the past, and I'm not going to name names, is there was this sort of perception or myth that accessibility is mostly a development or engineering exercise. Something doesn't work by keyboard, you have to fix it, or it doesn't work with a screen reader, so you have to fix it. So it was solely a engineering exercise. Did you get to work this way because somebody told you so, or was it kind of a more organic development?
it was very organic. So
I'm getting very excited about it. Sorry.
Yeah, it's definitely organic, and I think one of the challenges I encountered in kind of like being involved was like, where do you start, right? Because accessibility is this huge challenge, and like it can be something that's daunting, and you're like, oh my God, am I being too idealistic? But I think what I've learned along the way is that if you can get a group of people who are committed to the idea and the philosophy of inclusive design or accessibility, and you can start small, you'd be surprised how much you can accomplish, like with little initiatives, building on each other. I forget if I answered your question.
No, that's perfect. What used to happen, and I used to be a developer. What used to happen was, you, as a developer, you get a bunch of bugs and you have to fix them, and for accessibility, and you look at them, and a lot of them have nothing to do with coding. So it's like, oh, we don't have enough color contrast, or we need, this label to be changed so that it reads X instead of Y. So there was a lot of kind of pressure on developers for doing things that were not really in their realm. So I'm very excited about this. Sorry, was there a question? Yeah.
Can we ask questions?
Sure. Let's see how many we get, and we'll take. You only have one, right? That's fine. Yeah.
I heard you say, what is it, inclusive design?
Yeah.
And I don't know what the difference is from accessible design. Is there a difference at all?
I can speak to my own personal perspective on it.
Go for it.
Unless George, you want to.
No, I think you're pretty qualified to talk about it.
Okay, I'll give it a good go. So in my mind, like, accessibility is looking at user experience from the perspective of, can different people use this product, service, interface, and is it accessible or usable by various different groups? When I think about inclusive design, I see it as you're designing for diversity. And it's not about optimizing for a particular group with a particular set of abilities or disabilities. It's about, how can we design something that will help the most people possible? So that's kind of how I look at it. And I find inclusive design is often something that's easier to talk about in a positive way, that can then get people more excited and more behind it from a user experience perspective. So I tend to talk more about that than accessibility when I have the option of, like, choosing one or the other.
What do you do? What do you do?
Front end and UX design.
Okay, cool. I was asking because Jen gave you the very user researcher answer, which is great, because Jen is a UX researcher. If you want an answer in terms of front-end engineering, it's like building a product and then realizing that somebody cannot use it with a keyboard because people may not be able to use it with a mouse for various reasons, and then you go back and fix it. You fix all your divs to be buttons and proper things that people can tap to. That's kind of accessibility, doing it after the fact. Inclusive design is when you start speccing out that product and you're like, well, we need to account for these users and these disabilities, and you build a product with those things in mind as requirements, not afterthoughts. Yeah. Cool. Any other interesting questions? And you can raise your hand and say aye, because I'm figuratively and not seeing half of the room. Okay. That is awesome. Thank you. Quick question in terms of organization. How does the accessibility team look like? And I'm going to ignore you here, Jordy.
You can ask me. It's a good question.
No, I'm going to ignore you. How does the accessibility team look like at Mozilla and Shopify? Is it a well-established team? Is it?
I could go first if you want. So yeah, we have a pretty well-established team. We've got dedicated engineers on front end, platform, QA/evangelist/project manager. I'm administrative overhead mainly and do patch reviews and socialization. But also there's a lot more to making that work. You can't have a team that's like a silver bullet and solves all the accessibility. You gotta get your tendrils out. You've got to make the one-on-one connections. That's probably a good segue to Jen, I think.
Yeah, it's pretty organic. So at Shopify, we don't really have anyone who owns accessibility officially. We recently hired someone who's looking after inclusion from a culture perspective. So that's exciting. I think that will be a sign of like more to come. I think that person is focused more on our people and like people who work at Shopify, but She's also interested in how we can make our products and our services and experiences more inclusive as well. So far, I'd say if I were to say one team who owns it most, I'd probably say the front-end development team and also the UX team kind of more broadly. Yeah, I think it's been mostly up to the people's initiatives, like everyone's individual initiative around the topic. And I've been facilitating those conversations, and we have like every 3 weeks a meeting to kind of catch up on what we're all working on and share knowledge, experience. For example, like one of our front-end developers did an audit of a particular part of our product, and then another front-end developer was like, "Oh, can I have a look at what you did, and can I recycle that? Can I reuse
No,
it?"
your audit didn't come with fees, right? Like you're not supposed to pay a penalty if you okay.
It was
Jordy was like his ears were.
Not that kind of audit. Yeah. So it's been a very decentralized ownership model that we have. People are kind of taking initiative and taking ownership in their own ways, but that might change over time. This is kind of like early days.
Sounds good. The more traditional model, or the model in more traditional places like banks, is to have a very, very centralized team that does kind of everything and oversees accessibility progress. So there are different models in which accessibility can function, but that's sort of the key takeaway is that it really depends on your culture and organization and so on. Does this make sense to everyone? Do you have any questions? Because a lot of this stuff comes from how the company actually works, because you can't do accessibility completely different than the rest of the company. I think I see a hand. Yeah.
Yeah, there's no one size fits all for this.
I have a question about one of the points that was mentioned earlier is that currently intranets are exempt from having to comply to the AODA. I'm wondering if there's a known reason for that, and if that, I mean, because that could, theoretically actually cause some real challenges for people that have been hired and are not able to use the company intranets.
Yeah, that's a good question. And just to repeat it, I mentioned that intranets are exempted for private sector companies under the AODA. Public sector have to do something about it. The reason is essentially, like, I don't know exactly why it's housed the way it is, but there is a clause in the employment standard, which is one of the 5 standards, that says workplace information needs to be accessible to your employees, essential workplace information. So, when you're doing these things from 5,000 feet, you try to keep things high level, right? Because there's 392,000 organizations that need to meet these requirements, right? So we try not to be too prescriptive in senses like these. But if you're a person working in a company and the intranet is not accessible under the workplace information requirements of the employment standard, that company does need to provide you that information in a format that's accessible to you. So if that means making their intranet accessible, that may be an option. If it means finding another way to provide the information, that's also an option. It's up to the individual and the company. So there are requirements in there to make sure employees get information they need, but they're not specific to intranets unless it's a public sector organization.
It could just make it really challenging for, say, a blind developer who needs to work on, a company CMS.
I absolutely agree.
We also have something called the Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms. So this also falls under that. So if somebody has a systemic issue in the workplace where they cannot function, then that comes into place as well. Let's not go into that rabbit hole yet. How do you? I'm trying to decide between 2 questions. Do you have any sort of trick or cheat or something that you discovered that may not be well known that you do kind of on a regular basis in terms of accessibility, whether it's user research or engineering or farming? Whoever wants to go first.
I could take a stab at it. Maybe this is a cheat, but I'm just going to say communication. Like one of the things I find myself doing a lot is forcing engineers to talk to each other. And I remember as an engineer, you carve out your block of time and you just want to go and you solve problems, right? When you want to scale accessibility, you can't do that without communication, right? Obviously, so it's a huge skill to develop. In my case, I'm best one-on-one. This is a bit of an exception for me, but develop one-on-one relationships with every team. If you can get somebody, owning, just like fire wardens. Every office has a fire warden, right? To make sure everyone gets out. Every team should have somebody, and I think this is sort of what you have, who sort of owns accessibility. So on front end, we already have our mole there. We have our accessibility person. We'll help out. We can write patches. My team can write patches, but that's not what you want. You want to get your tendrils out there and to get everybody helping to make it awesome.
Cool.
I'm kind of stumped, to be honest, in terms of like tips and checklists like tools.
I'm kind of cheating here because I know a little bit about your work at Shopify. Was it impactful to show the results of doing usability studies with people with disabilities back to engineers and so on?
Oh, yes. I can speak to that, yes. Yeah. So a couple of the things that we did to build awareness around the topic early on were a couple of accessibility demos. Actually, we ran 3 in total. So we had one in Montreal, one in Toronto, and one in Ottawa. And each of those 3 offices has a different focus in terms of project work. And so what we did was we brought someone in from the blind community and had them go through the experience of, for example, going through the Shopify.com website or the Shopify product or shopping on a Shopify store and trying to purchase something. And it was really humbling for people, whether they were a designer or developer or a different discipline, to watch someone go through that experience using the technology they're usually accustomed to using. And that, I think, generated a lot of conversation and awareness. So that was a really good starting point for a lot of people to realize the impact of what they do and how they could look at things differently. And that got some things started, so yeah.
Yeah, I can back that argument because I've done that in a bunch of places as well. So nothing humbles people more than showing how the product they built is not working for some people. So that works. It's very powerful. Sorry, there's a question. Yeah, go for it.
A follow-up to that, because in order to get that person to use the site and to, you're obviously willing to listen. So my question is what did it get? What happened at Shopify that gave you that willingness to listen? Because obviously something changed and you started organically taking, importance in that process. I'm just wondering what changed that made you even, get to listen.
Yeah.
Let me repeat the question for our video recording. So what triggered you, or what triggered Shopify to even do the user research with people with disabilities? What made you think? What made you listen to that feedback in the first place?
So I think that was kind of where I was like, oh, maybe if I were to think of one tip, I might say this. So it was going to be to try and hire people who have an awareness and appreciation for it, because I think a big part of what got things started was people on the team already had an interest. Like certain people, it only took like 1 or 2 people to kind of instigate. And in this case, I think it started in Montreal, where our now director of design there had a big appreciation for accessibility and really was an advocate. So she was like, you know what, guys, we spend so much time designing the checkout experience on Shopify, but it's not accessible. We could do better. And I know a friend who's from the blind community who will willingly come here and do a demo for us. So she organized it, and it was a really small team at the time. And so it was kind of unescapable for people to see the demo happen in the office. So she set it up in a very public space in the office. And because it was a very relatable experience, you're buying something online, people just kind of naturally came by to look at what was happening. And yeah, that's kind of how it started.
I can speak to that too, George. We spend a lot of time trying to convince people to care about this, obviously. And the role of champions is very important. If there's somebody central in the organization that is advocating for this, that's very important. But the other tactic we use is just simply, pointing out that, people with disabilities have money, right? How many people here have parents who have more money than they do? Right? Everybody does. If you look at the Ministry of Finance's population projections, this year, there's two lines, and they go like this. This is the line of the people in Ontario who are under 14, and this is the line of the people in Ontario who are over 60, and it's just surpassed it. There's a huge generation of baby boomers entering into their senior years. As you get older, it becomes much more likely that you're going to have reduced sight, reduced vision, reduce everything. And these people have all the money. It's the richest generation in Ontario's history. They have all the money. They're spending it on vacations, decorating their homes, buying new appliances, everything. And more, they're spending it online. I did a presentation for a series of not-for-profits. I asked them, what percentage of your donations come from online donations? Generally it was between 60 and 70%. And I said, how many of those donations do you think are coming from seniors right now? And you need to get out there and make your online donation systems accessible. And I think that's the kind of thing that really rings true as well.
I think there was a question.
You were getting back to the rules whereby your company's internal documents and things like that. What would you do in the case of where it's an American headquarters where all the information is sent out from, but it's an Ontario location?
Yeah, the jurisdictional things.
Repeat the question, please?
Oh yeah, sorry. So it's a question about what happens if there's an American headquarters, and everything's coming from the American headquarters. The states has stronger legislation than we do. So generally, in that case, it's not a huge problem. Interprovincially, it does become an issue. We say if the site is owned and operated by a company in Ontario, then you have to comply by our laws. Owned and operated has a shifty definition, though. So it is an issue, it's really a case-by-case thing. Like, you really have to dive down into the weeds, and usually you end up dealing with the company's legal department, and they advise, either they have to comply or they don't. But generally, if the company's owned and operated, and the site is owned and operated in the province, then they have to comply with the laws.
Yes, another question.
So we hire a lot of third parties to audit our site, and they give us differing opinions on the best way to make it accessible.
No, really?
So we could be working on the same thing for like the same tiny element for a month because of differing opinions. How do you know you're doing it right?
So the question is, we hire a lot of third-party people, companies to audit, and we get different responses. How do you know which one is right? And who's we, by the way, if I may ask?
Vital Source, it's an American company, education media.
Awesome. Do you have any answers?
Do I have an answer?
Anybody who has any answers? I'm basically deferring to you.
Well, I mean, I can speak to what the Ontario laws say, right? So Ontario's laws point to WCAG. The WCAG success criteria can be met in many different ways. And that's even one of the qualifiers that W3C points out. So, I mean, we lay out, like our webpage on Ontario's accessibility laws just links right over to WCAG W3C. My best advice to you is, it's your problem if your company is not compliant. So if you're going through and you're seeing, I'm not sure this success criteria is fulfilled, then I would take action on it and ask for best advice. I pointed out a lot of resources where you could get our best advice on the issues, and we got a booth outside where you can pick up a little card that'll guide you right through that. But the definitions are fluid, and I don't think that's ever going to change because web content is so diverse. Like you can't like lay down the law. This font is accessible. This color is accessible. This color is not. You know what I mean?
As somebody who has been on both sides, both providing an audit or review or whatever you want to call it, and being on the receiving end, as a company, if you don't have that capacity to be able to tell if what you're getting is valid or not, then you won't be able to tell, which one is valid or more valid. But I have an interesting, I think it's interesting. I have a question. Why do you get input from different auditors, I guess, or different companies?
I think it's preference, like how we mark up a link just changes based on who's looking at it.
Okay.
I think it would be accessible either way, but
Yep.
they're the ones that give the recommendation for the VPAT, so.
So, okay, that's another rabbit hole right there. So a VPAT is something that you have to fill in the United States in order to do business with the government. You basically have to self-assess and report how accessible the product you're going to sell to the government is. So, rabbit hole. Good luck with the VPAT. We're almost at time, so we have 5 more minutes. I only have one last question, which is, and we kind of touched on it a little bit when we started. How do you see the how do you see accessibility as a professional or as a career developing? Do you see this as a growing sort of market or domain, or how do you see it based on your experiences? Jen, I'm asking Jen. Sorry.
Okay.
Ladies first.
Thanks, George. So I think that in the short term, it could look like having specialized roles, like where someone owns accessibility and like leads initiatives and facilitates that stuff. Down the road, ideally, I'd love to see it become much more embedded in multiple roles, and be a part of the skill set of a developer, a designer, a content strategist, a researcher. I think I'm pretty hopeful that that'll happen. Like looking at some of the demographic shifts, the aging population, it's going to become a lot more real for us that either the problems will become more real or the benefits will become real, depending on what people respond better to. I think it'll become more and more relatable for people. So, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. Sorry, go ahead, David.
Okay, sure. Whoever was at the keynote this morning, I think you saw him talk about sort of like horizontal concepts. Accessibility is sort of a horizontal concept. It matters with software procurement, development, hiring, everything, right? Very needed. One of the interesting things for me is to see the evolution of accessibility tech over time. The latest phase has been semantics, adding semantics to places where there isn't any, having assistive technology pick it up. The next phase is going to be very interesting. It's going to be disruptive. We're seeing a lot of advances in machine learning. We're going to see like the wearables that we saw in the keynote. That stuff's going to be huge, in my opinion, in the next 5-10 years. So it's going to be a very exciting space. It's going to be multidisciplinary, and it's a great thing to hang your hat on. That's about it.
Thank you. Jordy, you have an opinion?
I agree. I mean, I don't think it's going away anytime soon. I think it's a specialization that eventually everybody's going to familiarize themselves with. I mentioned the Registered Graphic Designers Association. Now, if you want to become a registered graphic designer in Ontario, you need to complete courses on accessible design. And I think there's going to be more professions that are headed that way. The same is true of a professional planner. The Ontario Professional Planners Institute has introduced requirements for learning how to incorporate accessibility in professional planning. So I think more and more professions are headed that way. I think you saw it in the room, how quickly accessibility has sort of moved through the industry, and I think it's going to continue.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, this is it for us. I hope this was useful for you and informative, and you get to use this in your jobs. Good luck. Thank you.